Today we're going to talk about business and human rights, a subject that is so vast that it is linked to many other human rights issues like migrant workers, childcare, labor conditions, production of energy, the electricity we use, agriculture, nutrition, the food we are eating, and poverty, to count a few. Well, we have an amazing line of experts to explain us all about human rights and business. So I'm not going to talk any further, and I would like to give the floor to Friederike Wünschmann, a colleague of ours from the delegation of the European Union to Turkey. The floor is yours, Friederike.
Thank you very much. I mean, first of all, of course, I have to say that I'm not an expert. The experts will come after me. Welcome, everyone, to this Etkiniz webinar on business and human rights. My name is Friederike Wünschmann, and I have the pleasure of being the program manager for this program. I just would like to take a couple of minutes to tell you why business and human rights is important for the European Union. First of all, if you are human rights experts, you probably might know this. The promotion of human rights is one of the EU key objectives, and it's actually enshrined in the EU treaties. And this is the obligation to respect human rights and to protect against abuse by third parties, including private actors. Secondly, we have to acknowledge that there's a growing recognition of the impact of business on society, health, and environment. EU citizens, consumers, but most of all, investors and shareholders increasingly expect from companies that they offer fair working conditions and apply a more sustainable use of resources. The expectation is that companies must comply with human rights, prevent and mitigate any negative impacts they may cause. And lastly, you also might know that the EU as a bloc is the largest economy in the world. Many EU companies are involved in global supply chains for products. Therefore, the EU has the specific responsibility to encourage companies in their efforts to conduct their business responsibly and in respect of human rights. So what have we done so far? What have the EU done so far? We have developed a couple of policy documents where business and human rights are in the focus. For example, from 10 years ago, we had a renewed strategy for corporate social responsibility. And the last EU action plan on human rights and democracy also features business and human rights. Then the EU has developed a couple of legislation addressing human rights abuses. For example, we have the sectorial binding rules on human rights due diligence for e-companies operating abroad. We have measures to ensure access to remedy for victims, the Victims' Rights Directive, for example. And then probably you might not know this, but since 25 years actually, the EU, whenever they conclude a new trade agreement, they have systematically, we include clauses on human rights. Today, most of the trade agreements that the EU has concluded are subject to human rights conditionality. We also have a couple of projects, techno-assistance projects, which deal with business and human rights. Predominantly, they were in Asia and Latin America, but I also would like to announce here and today that this year we will have one pilot action on business and human rights, which is financed through the civil society facility. We're very excited that we finally have a project on business and human rights where we also count on the cooperation of this civil society facility. Just a couple of words for the challenges for the EU, particular for the EU. Meaningful and concrete progress on business and human rights requires the increased linkage of promotion and protection of human rights to global issues. As I've said before, trade, investment, environment, social protection, tax, evasion, corruption. As many of these issues are actually handled by each member state individually, for example, environment, for example, taxes, there's a huge need for coordination, cooperation among all the EU institutions and all the member states. Secondly, you will later on hear about the National Action Plan to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Only 16 EU member states have adopted the National Action Plan. So you can see there's work to be done that also the remaining countries adopt the National Action Plan. And then basically also imagine you're Coca-Cola and you want to do business in Europe. There is a fragmented landscape of existing and envisaged regulatory measures in the EU. So it makes it very difficult for companies to operate in the EU single market, because some countries have very strict and very strong regulations and legislation on business and human rights, the other ones not. In 2019, actually a little bit more than a year ago, in December 2019, the Finnish EU presidency were actually the first ones who called for an agenda for action on business and human rights. Which, and what does it mean? It means that really the EU member states should jointly work on an action plan on business and human rights. There's also talk about, I think my colleagues, they will later on talk more about this, about some binding legislation on also in the EU, on EU level. Let's see what the future brings. But now I stop here, because now I really leave the floor to the specialist, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Friederike. This is a very informative, because everyone is actually also thinking about what about the EU? What is EU is doing about business and human rights? So that's very much appreciated, your intervention. Our next speaker is Dante Pesce. He is the chairperson of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And he's also the executive director of Vernacular Center on Sustainable Businesses at the Catholic University of Valparaiso, Chile. He has many other hats. I'm not going to go into detail so that he can actually just tell all these himself, and also tell us about what is business and human rights. When we say business and human rights, what are we meaning?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and hello, Başak and Friederike. We run into each other once in a while, every year at least, in Turkey lately, but also at the forum in Geneva, and so we know each other already. And it's good to engage again with civil society from Turkey, as almost exactly 1 year I was in Ankara, also in an event organized with the support of the EU to basically work on awareness raising and the need for capacity building, and calling for greater level of cooperation and collaboration. So happy to engage again. I prepared some slides that I recycled from last year's presentation. It will be significantly shorter, but I was reviewing them and they remain relevant with some, let's say, changes that have happened in the last year, and notably, of course, COVID, that have shown us where we don't have strong governance, or where we have weak governance, things can go really, really bad and ugly, and where we need to actually stress the need for higher standards and minimums that should be in place everywhere in the world, and where actually, if we want to have a shared future, this has been an eye-opening for some, or a confirmation for many, that we have governance gaps, and where we should and be able to do much better as we look into the future. So let me start by sharing my screen with you, with a presentation that I can, of course, share with you, and you can keep it, so that's no problem. And I will start sharing some, let's say, of my remarks, followed with this slides. Very happy to engage with you bilaterally if needed. We have a secretariat based in Geneva, but also UNDP, who is becoming a key partner for us globally in the reach for greater implementation. They have established a permanent position in Istanbul for Eastern Europe and Central Asia with the aim to support national governments and all stakeholders in the push for greater uptake of the business and human rights agenda. I'm from Chile in South America, so my language is Spanish, but I'm very surprised to be using this platform with interpretation. That I have seen that before, but also with the writing on the bottom, which is very surprising for me, but for good, I think is good. Okay, so the first thing that I would like to share is the starting point is a political agreement reached by governments. So I will not go into all the details of the guiding principles, but just to say that the Human Rights Council is a 100% intergovernmental body that reached a consensus in 2011 with the adoption of the guiding principles that provides guidance, that provides a vision and an understanding in how to connect human rights with business and business impacts. And that is very important to say that all governments are on board with very clearly different levels of commitment and political will regarding implementation. But at least we have a starting point, a baseline where we can build on top of, and it is not being disputed. And that's good news. We are not being disputed by any government to say we should erase or eliminate or modify or water down the principles that have been agreed. And in this year, we will be celebrating the 10th anniversary, and we are running an evaluation of the first 10 years of implementation with some lessons learned. But the good news is that I wouldn't say that the glass is half empty, but it's not empty, or half full. But it's not a half full glass yet, but it's not empty. And that's the point that I want to make, where we see opportunities and where we see progress taking place, not yet on scale and speed, not yet everywhere, not yet reaching to all companies, much less SMEs, much less the informal economy. We are in a pioneer level, but at least we are in a pioneer level. And we're taking it from there. Second thing, a reminder of how the structure of the guiding principles is presented. A first pillar regarding state obligations in terms of setting the expectations, providing the smart mix of policy measures that includes mandatory and non-mandatory measures. We are clearly moving from less mandatory and more soft law into more mandatory and more hard law, especially in the context of Europe. And of course, my colleague Başak will certainly step into that point with, I assume, with greater detail. And of course, we can come back to that point later. But we see that as a positive trend. But also it includes the state as an economic actor. And those activities that states control directly, like state-owned enterprises or public procurement or export credits, and also touches upon other measures regarding, for example, free trade agreement or incentives at policy level, at the national level, or concessions, for example. So all the area of regulation where there is an interface between government and business. So all regulated sectors of the economy, listed companies, concessionaries of telecom or energy or roads, etc. All that is covered under Pillar 1. And Pillar 1 is presented as state duty, or in other form, state obligations. So when the government signed up for the guiding principles, they were committing to actually translate these principles into actions, not only for someone else, private sector companies, but for themselves, getting the house in order and leading by example. The second pillar is touches upon business. and business of all kinds, state-owned, private, big and small, formal and hopefully informal, where we have not worked a lot, but we know that 60% of the workforce of the world works in the informal economy. And within the informal economy, we have the illegal economy, which is also quite big, especially in my part of the world, hugely big and sadly influential and corrosive. And business should act preventively with due diligence at its core. And I will get back to the due diligence framework, but today in Turkey, as member of the OECD, you have a mandatory abiding obligation to implement due diligence at the national level. Why? Because everything that is agreed in the context of the OECD is of binding nature, which means that the OECD guidelines for multinational corporations on responsible business conduct or the OECD guidelines on due diligence are mandatory. And governments commit to do their best effort to translate that political agreement into something operational. The OECD doesn't provide any guidance on how to do that. And there's a peer review mechanism that is somehow soft with very limited consequences for not complying. But nevertheless, governments, including the Turkish one and my own government, the Chilean one, has committed to binding commitments around the OECD agreements. And conducting due diligence throughout the value chain to identify and address negative impacts regarding human rights. And the third pillar, which is the reality check, is when governments fail in their duty to protect, when business fails in their responsibility to respect human rights, what happens with real people? What are the obstacles? What are the mechanisms? What is the practical experience? When things go wrong, what happens with people that suffer consequences? And this is the reality check in terms, which is the third pillar, is access to remedy. So access to remedy is not the entry point, but the entry point is prevention, policy framework, enabling environment, leading by example, is due diligence, again, prevention at its core. But when things go wrong, what happens? And what is the journey and the practical experience, the obstacles that real people face in reality? And this is the reality check. We present access to remedy as part of a preventative approach, for example, on grievances and as early alerts, yellow flags, and as an opportunity to actually engage constructively with critical voices that are seeing what business and government is not seeing, because civil society, especially unions, especially, are closer to reality and face the negative consequences very tangibly and sometimes directly. So becoming victims, let's say, of human rights abuses. So the access to remedy element is a reality check of when things don't go right, assuming that both governments and business are acting in good faith. When they don't act in good faith, of course, things go wrong up front. But that is, let's say, a separate conversation, maybe a parallel conversation in terms of good governance or bad governance, etc. Then the guiding principles have been included, integrated increasingly in frameworks around the world. I will not go into any detail here, just to say that today they are not disputed. They are the authoritative framework to understand the relation between human rights and business, and are being used by many, many institutions and initiatives around the world, of course, including the EU, in setting policies. And that is good news. So we have normalized the conversation on business and human rights at the global governance level. We have normalized the principles of the guiding principles, including due diligence as an entry point, with prevention at its core. We have normalized the conversation around the three pillars, and it's now being used, for example, for environmental policies, the role of government, or combating corruption, role of government, role of business, and access to remedy. So on that regard, the guiding principles have been somehow a success story in terms of framing a conversation that was not clear enough. And it was sometimes fuzzy, and it was not clear cut who's doing what and what is expected from one's obligations, responsibilities, and access to remedy. Another good, let's say, development is that the guiding principles are included explicitly in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Paragraph 67 references explicitly the guiding principles as lens to be weighed by business while contributing to sustainable development. And it's paragraph 67 and the chapter called Means for Implementation. And there's one realization in this conversation on sustainable development, that there is no sustainable development without responsible business conduct. There is an invitation to business to be part of the solution of societal challenges, the understanding that we have to all be on board if we really want to tackle systemic challenges. It requires a systemic approach where everyone not only is welcome, but it has to be part of the solution. And that invitation is explicitly stated in Goal 17, but also then is explicitly cited and described the role of business to not just be a cherry picking approach, but actually contributing to the Sustainable Development Agenda. Contribute to the Sustainable Development Agenda explicitly wearing lens of the guiding principles and other standards of the guiding principles as their commitment to the Sustainable Development Agenda. This has been followed by declaration by several industry associations around the world, as you can also see on the screen, committing to the implementation of the guiding principles and to different levels of integration of the principles into their agenda and their practices. Notably, the mining industry has done a very good job in stating that integrating human rights into business practices by the mining sector is explicitly stated as a commitment that all members should integrate. But also you can see this development taking place in Asia, and the Chinese Industry Association for Mining and Minerals Import and Export has committed to due diligence as well, and they contracted the OECD to develop for them guidance and a step-by-step approach. So this is not something that is only happening in the, let's say, Western Hemisphere and Western Europe, but it's also taking place and in other parts of the world, somehow unexpectedly also in China. And I can go, of course, a lot more on this point. And we have issued guidance for industry associations to actually do this, take the lead, provide clear expectations to their members, set clear benchmarks, and commit to deliver in practice by their members, and a call for collective actions led by the industries themselves if they want to avoid unnecessary regulation that is too prescriptive and perhaps not suitable for all industries and all contexts of the world. So we have actually welcomed this development taking place and being led by industry associations. One very interesting and good guidance that was published 2 years ago by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, it provides a good picture of what are the drivers. And this has been signed up by a large number of CEOs of fairly large companies in the world, and basically stating something that for the insiders of this agenda is somehow obvious, but it's not necessarily the case for everyone else. One thing is that societal expectations are on the rise, in some places faster than others, but clearly communication, information is available, and we have an even more educated society around the world, especially among the youth. There's also a regulatory wave on its way coming to us, and companies should be aware of that and basically be proactive now and not reactive later, but this is something that is going to stay. The investors are actually paying more attention to risks in terms of allocation of investments and resources, and the business-to-business relation is actually increasing or improving the quality of the relation in some cases, but also traceability is on the center of business-to-business relations. And of course, if any of your industries is export-oriented to Western Europe, I'm sure that are being asked more and more and more by clients and retailers and let's say of all kinds about practices inside the company, how well or bad they operate, etc. Also, the World Business Council provides guidance for leadership, and they say this agenda is not something to be subcontracted or led by a middle management level. This is something that has to be pushed from the highest level of the company, the governance level, and led by the CEO, and this is CEO job, because this is linked clearly to the sustainability or the viability of the company. And what should a CEO or a leader of a company should do? First of all, understand what are the impacts of my company regarding human rights, or you can say environmental impacts, etc. Show commitment, the knowing and showing that the guiding principles suggest. Lead from the top, which is not only leading in a narrative or a speech, but actually providing the means for implementing and translating good intentions into real practice, and then collaborate outside of the comfort zone. And having difficult conversations like taxation or corruption or corporate capture of the state or modern slavery or discrimination by any means, have those conversations in the context of your association or in the context of your membership-based institution, in order to engage with the rest of the society, in order not to hide or to run away or to look to the side from problems, but actually addressing them because they are societal challenges to be addressed properly. And this is something that should be the work of led by CEOs. So in short, doing the right thing, and this is something that the High Commissioner have said, has become the smart thing to do. And there's a connection here, positive connection between respecting human rights and long-term or medium-term, at least, competitiveness and profitability for companies. And this realization that there is, on top of a moral case or moral obligation, a positive business case for some companies, not for all companies, for some companies, is actually that something positive that is driving action and capturing attention from a growing number of companies around the world. So how to be part of the solution of societal problems and challenges? And the short answer is due diligence, which is the tool to understand the impacts and how to, in a step-by-step approach, integrate those findings into policies and operations. The main objective of due diligence is to help companies to know and show their commitment, focusing on prevention, and that is the core of due diligence. And due diligence is not something to be reinvented. We have methodology. We have a step-by-step approach that has been agreed, and it has been based on participation and how to develop that methodology. The guiding principles state clearly due diligence at its core and at its center. And we are combining and working, and the guiding principles have been embedded by the OECD in all their frameworks, notably the general due diligence framework that was presented and agreed upon among governments 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, which is of mandatory nature, is binding for Turkey, also my own country. And we have elaborated a connection between the OECD due diligence framework and the guiding principles. And basically what we say is something very simple. If your country is signatory or member of the OECD, this is the entry point. Due diligence is the entry point where we have convergence and where we have agreement and where there is a methodology that includes also access to remedy. And we organized 2.5 years ago a forum on due diligence dedicated to due diligence in Geneva. And some of the conclusions are still valid. It is possible. We have pioneers. We're still not good on speed and scale, but we have pioneers. The investors are the track that is the most promising in this agenda because they are moving in the right direction and more embedding this agenda into their investment practices and policies. And what is lacking in this agenda is the political will and the capacity of our governments, which is the last point. Our governments are the most absent in this agenda. So in terms of creating an enabling environment for due diligence or overall respect for human rights, we need our governments to step up and to do their part. For the most part, this is the lacking or the laggards. Our governments, not our big brands of business around the world, and of course, much less civil society, unions, indigenous people, etc., which of course it's in your interest or our collective interest to make this agenda work. And this is a very, often, almost difficult, very difficult to address challenge, because our governments are not necessarily showing the political will that we need. Regarding knowing and showing, just one comment. Often some business and many, very often governments say, knowing is very difficult. And therefore, this is an agenda that is wishful thinking because we can't really know. Then I would like to challenge that because, for example, in Turkey, we know a lot about Turkey, about environmental, and I have a lot of slides here hidden that you can, of course, see later. This is just a map that I copy-paste from a website about environmental conflicts in Turkey taking place right now. And of course, they are all linked to human rights up and down. This is the Business and Human Rights Resource Center monitoring Turkish business and international business operating in Turkey with dedicated site and information. This is the CSR risk checker of the Dutch government, done conjointly or at the same time with business from the Netherlands, showing what is the map of risks of Turkey and what Dutch investors or clients or business partners can expect and should expect to address, and what are the, let's say, the expected risks to take on board and to consider in the case of Turkey. So just knowing is possible. The point is showing commitment and the political will that is needed to get things done in reality. So finally, this is the last slide in terms of main challenges. The main challenge is political will. We have the tools, we have the instruments, we have growing experience, but we haven't been able to move from pioneers to mainstream. So we need, for business, much greater ambition and show real commitment. We need collective actions. We need better knowledge management where we can connect dots and show that those that are ahead of the curve can show in the pre-competitive space that progress is possible and sharing makes sense. And overall leadership to show, to honor the commitments that most part of large companies have made, but still fail to fully implement throughout the world and their subsidiary supply chains, etc. And then from governments, again, is the same thing as political will. So stating the vision and ambition, and that should be translated in a national action plan on business and human rights. Policy coherence at its center. It was mentioned before that we have a patchwork of initiatives, but no real coherent approach for the most part in most part of the world. And the leading by example element to get the house in order and all those agendas and policy measures that are directly linked to the state as an economic actor is lagging for the most part around the world. But if I can conclude, this is an agenda that is moving forward. We see that actually this is an agenda that is possible to have, but is an agenda that requires a systemic approach in order to move forward with much greater ambition. And that is what we're actually doing right now. On the 16th of June this year, we will present the roadmap into the next decade and beyond of global implementation, providing strategic guidance to all stakeholders, but mostly governments and business in terms of the road to follow and how to achieve much more significant positive impacts on the ground than what we have achieved so far. So the half empty part of the glass, or more than half empty, we would like to fill it up as we move into the next decade of global implementation. And so far, so good in terms of commitment from business, civil society, and governments to be part of that coalition of the willing that we're putting together and trying to raise the ambition looking into the future. With that said, thank you very much again, and happy to remain in any form of engagement with you. And I will, of course, remain connected throughout the rest of the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante, for this. You really walked us through the guiding principles and provided us with, especially the Turkish NGOs, a number of very useful guides that they can use in their human rights monitoring activities. At the moment, we are moving to a very dear friend of mine, Başak Bağlayan. She's a postdoctoral researcher in fundamental rights at the University of Luxembourg, the Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance, and she's working with the Luxembourg government and the European Affairs Department, especially on business and human rights. The floor is yours, Başak.
Adem asked me to speak to you about business and human rights developments in Luxembourg and the role of the civil society in Luxembourg. So I will do that. So that will be like the two parts of my intervention. But before doing that, I would like to just briefly mention some facts about Luxembourg, which I think is nice, because also I understand that not everybody is necessarily informed about Luxembourg. So then, let me see if I will mention. So Luxembourg is a rather small country. You see here, it's a landlocked country in Western Europe, between Belgium, Germany, and France. And it's, as I said, it's a rather small country. And I was actually checking the size of the towns in Turkey to give you an idea for comparison reasons. And apparently Luxembourg is almost the same size as Düzce. So it is half size of Istanbul. And there are 600,000 people living in Luxembourg. And another interesting fact is that almost half of these people, so 47% of these people, are non-Luxembourgers, so they are foreigners. There are 3 official languages in Luxembourg. They speak French, German, and Luxembourgish. And it is the only Grand Duchy in the world. So it is the only Grand Duchy in the world. It is the 3rd richest country in the world as well. Friederike, the other day I told you it is the 2nd one, but then I checked, apparently it is the 3rd richest country, GDP per capita though, GDP per capita in the world. And some just random facts that I find interesting. Luxembourg legalized same-sex marriage in 2014, and Luxembourg's Prime Minister, Javier Bettel, is the first EU leader who married to a same-sex person. That I find rather cool. Luxembourg is also the country where the Schengen Agreement was signed, and the Schengen Agreement is the agreement which allows EU members, citizens to move freely from one country to another. And it is a small town in Luxembourg where Germany and France meet with Luxembourg. The agreement was signed there. Luxembourg is also one of the capitals of the EU, together with Brussels and Strasbourg. It is one of the capitals of the EU. You see here we have the Court of Justice of the European Union, that is the highest court in the EU, that is located in Luxembourg. And finally, one more thing I want to mention, that Luxembourg, for the first time in its history, is going to be bidding for the Human Rights Council membership that Dante was mentioning. The UNGPs were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council. So Luxembourg will be bidding for a membership at the UN Human Rights Council, which means that over the next months, until October, when the decisions are taking place, we are going to see a lot of human rights campaigns, a lot of focus on human rights in Luxembourg, which makes it all the more interesting. So that was my quick overview about Luxembourg, and now I will move to the core of my intervention, and that is the business and human rights development in Luxembourg. And I think any BHR discussion in Luxembourg has to start with the working group in Luxembourg. That is obviously not the working group that Dante was mentioning, but it is the working group on business and human rights in Luxembourg, which was established in 2018. I'm sorry, there is a mistake in the slide. It was established in 2018. It wasn't until then, so it is very recent if you think of it, and it wasn't until then the business and human rights agenda started moving in Luxembourg. What happened was that in 2017, the former Human Rights Commissioner visited Luxembourg, and he had talks with the government, he had talks with the businesses, and really encouraged them to do something about business and human rights and to start implementing the UNGPs. And after his visit, a few months after his visit, the government decided to establish this working group, which is part of the, or which is under the Interministerial Committee on Human Rights that they have in Luxembourg. And both of this committee and the working group is convened and coordinated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And they are chaired by the Human Rights Ambassador of Luxembourg. So some details about this working group. There are 25 to 30 people sitting in this working group, and it is a truly multi-stakeholder group. So we have the representatives of the government, the ministries, but we also have civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, trade unions. We have business representatives and businesses themselves as well. And we have the academia. So before we got interrupted by the pandemic, we were meeting every 6 weeks and discussing various issues on business and human rights. But now, since March last year, we moved all the meetings online. So what this working group is doing now is actually implementing the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. What it did was also to elaborate and draft both versions of the National Action Plan in Luxembourg. And now maybe I will mention because Dante already referred to National Action Plans, but maybe I can give some more information about them. So as a general matter, 3 years after the adoption of the UNGPs, the UN Human Rights Council called actually on all member states to develop national action plans for the implementation of the UNGPs. And then this request was followed by the EU, Council of Europe, G7, G20 leaders. They all called the member states to adopt those national action plans and to prioritize certain action points and implement the UNGPs in their domestic national context. The working group that Dante is chairing as well is strongly encouraging all states to develop, enact, and update business and human rights national action plans. So until now, we have 24 states that have produced NAPs, and Friederike was saying 16 of them are EU member states, which is true, but also we have Colombia, Chile, the US, Kenya, Thailand, and Japan that have also produced those national action plans. So Luxembourg is also one of those countries that has produced a NAP. And what those NAPs are, they are basically policy instruments, and they are not legally binding instruments, but they are policy instruments that the states are setting out their priorities and actions to implement the UNGPs. With regards to Luxembourg's NAP, I'm not going to go into details, but maybe just give some general observations. So the first NAP in Luxembourg was adopted in June 2018. And it had a very clear time frame. It lasted until the end of 2019. And this actually was a good indication that the government was committing to sort of renew and, if necessary, update the National Action Plan to have this limited time frame. Other than that, instead of having a National Action Plan with, just once and putting it aside, Luxembourgish government committed that in 2 years, we are going to revise this NAP and, if necessary, update it. And that is what happened. So in the first NAP, there were 13 action points, and of these, 12 of them remained either unimplemented or only partially implemented. So they moved to the second NAP. And the second NAP was adopted in December 2019, and currently it is in place in Luxembourg. And this one has 20 action points, and we are now in the process of implementing those 20 action points. Although again, it is interrupted by the pandemic. In terms of process and structure and content, so I think the process in Luxembourg is promising for several reasons, and that is precisely because of that working group that I mentioned to you, because the working group and the working method of the group really allows for structured and ongoing dialogue among those different stakeholders. And the decisions taken at the working group are usually based on consensus. And on and it is really sometimes very hard to reach consensus. And on those points that we cannot reach consensus, the NAPs include annexes where different stakeholders can include their own divergent views. So there are short annexes. If you check the NAPs, you will see that different stakeholders express their views if we cannot agree on them. So the second NAP in particular now commits itself to a third-party evaluation, after the end of the implementation period, which is also a good thing. But I think what was one of the criticism raised in particular with regards to the process of first NAP was the lack of visibility of the working method of the working group. So this was a criticism that the working group heard a lot. But this was addressed now in the second NAP, and second NAP contains an action point on communication. So I think it will get better in this regard. Briefly, also in terms of content of the NAP and structure of the NAP, so both of the NAPs in Luxembourg recognizes that businesses have responsibility to respect human rights, obviously, in Luxembourg, but also abroad. This is very important considering the transnational character of many business activities. And both NAPs also identify certain sectors which are posing risks. And obviously one of those sectors in Luxembourg is financial sector, but we also have ICT, textile, agribusiness, logistics. So these sectors are identified as potentially risk sectors in Luxembourg. The NAPs also addresses some thematic issues like public procurement, but also human rights due diligence in public-private partnerships. The NAP, second one in particular, talks about the smart mix of measures that also Dante alluded to. But I think this smart mix of measures is not very balanced because the NAPs, both of them, is largely focused on awareness raising, training, capacity building, so largely focused on voluntary measures. But I think, and Dante can maybe confirm me on this, that usually that is the thing with the NAPs, that they are largely focused on these kind of more voluntary and soft approaches rather than hard regulatory commitments. So that's that about NAPs. In terms of structure, maybe I can say that the second NAP, those 20 action points, are organized around the 3 pillars of the UNGPs that Dante mentioned. But also this is not balanced because of these 20 action points, 15 of them are under the first pillar, and the other 2 pillars get then 3 and 2 action points respectively. And I think the content of the NAP could have significantly improved actually if there was a balance between those action points. So now, before moving to civil society, I just want to mention one more thing that relates to the NAP processes, and also that may be of interest to the audience, and that is the national baseline assessments. So the working group, again, Dante's working group, recommends that states conduct the national baseline assessments before adopting national action plans. So what these NBAs are, is that they are comprehensive studies that analyze the existing legal and policy framework in a country, and they identify gaps in the implementation of the UNGP so that when the country is adopting a NAP, they can be based on those findings of the national baseline assessment. A number of governments have already conducted those MBAs, either prior to developing their NAPs or as a part of their NAP commitment. And in Luxembourg as well, Luxembourg committed to have such a study in their first national action plan. And I had the pleasure and a bit of a pain to conduct this study for Luxembourgish government. So I'm happy to talk about the method and the findings and the results. But what I actually want to draw attention is that occasionally these studies are also conducted by civil society organizations or individual researchers, so without the involvement of government. And I think what I really find useful is that ICAR, so International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, and Danish Institute of Human Rights have produced a very detailed template based on the UNGPs, and I think Puna is going to send a link of that template to you now. So this template can be used to produce such a national baseline assessment. And I think it could be a good idea for interested organizations in Turkey as well, or researchers in Turkey, to adopt this template and draft a national baseline study that then can be used to sort of exert pressure to the government or the stakeholders or companies, or at least identify what are the main issues and have a campaign on those specific issues. So I think this may be a good idea. And as I said, there is already the template out there, and I would recommend this to the civil society organizations. So then coming back to Luxembourg, the current situation is that, as I said, we have the second NAP in place, but it is interrupted because of the pandemic. And at the same time, so in parallel to this National Action Plan, we also have, and this brings me to the actually role of the civil society, we also have a campaign in Luxembourg, a civil society campaign that is pushing for a mandatory human rights due diligence. And this is also true for several other European countries, that primarily this campaign is driven by civil society organizations. Okay, I'm missing a slide here. I think Pınar will send you a link now. I had another slide, but it is not there, that shows all those countries from Denmark, Norway, Spain, Italy, where civil society is taking action and implementing those campaigns for a mandatory human rights due diligence. So as Dante mentioned already, I think what we are seeing in business and human rights is a gradual legalization of the debate. So in particular, in reference to business and human rights due diligence obligations. Because as Dante also mentioned, human rights due diligence is one of the core components of the UNGPs, but it is also at the very center of those regulatory developments that are taking place in many countries in Europe, as well as at the European Union level. And as also again Dante mentioned, in general, many businesses have been in favor of the UNGPs right from the start. After a decade of implementation, I think what we are starting to see is that there is a bit of a lack of implementation of the UNGPs. There are several studies that have shown that companies are failing to meet even the basic requirements of the UNGPs, in particular on due diligence. So a study, for example, released by the European Commission last year found that only 1 in 3 companies in the European Union are conducting human rights due diligence. So really we can see that there is a lack of implementation. So then a general conclusion sort of is that reliance on voluntary or purely incentive-driven measures to promote business respect for human rights is not sufficient by its own, let's say. It's not sufficient by its own. So against this background, what we also see is that some states have started to move on and adopt laws on mandatory human rights due diligence, or some of them are considering adopting these laws. And I am happy to talk about the details of these laws and initiatives, both at the local level and at the EU level. But I think what is of relevance here is that in quite a few instances, as I said, CSOs have been the driving forces behind these campaigns for legislation for human rights due diligence. And that map, if Pınar will share with you, you will see in quite a few instances, we see active CSO action to bring this to the attention of the governments and move forward, which is also then the case in Luxembourg. We see in this slide, you see that in Luxembourg as well, we have a coalition of 16 CSOs, 17 CSOs, which have come together and which are advocating for a mandatory human rights due diligence in Luxembourg. And I think they have really been instrumental in advancing business and human rights debate in Luxembourg, not only with their work at the working group, because they are also participating in the working group, obviously, but also through this campaign for due diligence legislation. I think as a general matter here, there are 2 sort of broad approaches or 2 broad ways that the CSOs can engage in corporate accountability work. And one is more confrontational. So this would then include naming and shaming corporations, identifying and publicizing corporate malpractice, bringing cases against companies, bringing complaints against OECD NCPs. Dante mentioned that Turkey is an OECD member, which means that they have a national contact point as well. So then cases can be brought in those national contact points against companies. So this is rather a confrontational model of engagement with corporate behavior, I would say. But this approach has some clear limitations because, for example, when we talk about naming and shaming, obviously not every company is vulnerable to naming and shaming. This would largely work with companies who are brand oriented, who are brand sensitive. But if a company is not less brand oriented, let's say, this wouldn't impact them so much. So this approach has certain limitations. But even beyond that, what we also started to see is that in many instances, the harms that result is due to either lack of knowledge or weak procedures. So in those cases, I think helping businesses to build knowledge and capacity is much more helpful, actually, much more useful than condemning them or confronting them. So this is, I think, one way to look at this. The second way, generally, that the CSOs can, I think, engage with companies or corporate accountability work is a rather collaborative approach. So then this would involve undertaking partnership with businesses, providing trainings, advisory services, awareness raising, helping businesses monitor their standards. We also see a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives. We see a lot of certification schemes. But again, this also has a risk or has a sort of potentially negative consequence, and that would be that in some cases, civil society organizations have been accused for greenwashing corporate behavior or helping corporations to greenwash their malpractice. So I think there are both positive and negative sides in each of these approaches, and I think CSOs need to really strike a fine balance between being confrontational and being collaborative in engaging corporate accountability work. When it comes to the civil society in Luxembourg, and this is my personal observation, I think they are doing both of these. So I think they are being collaborative because they sit around the table with businesses, they negotiate with them, they help them devise training plans, but they are also being confrontational as well. They publish the name of the companies we hear often. They have demonstrations, you see this in the picture. So they are, I think, adapting and using both of these methods, which is, I think, working okay. So I have mentioned sort of couple of ways, only couple of ways that CSOs can engage in corporate accountability work at a national level. And this can, of course, very easily be moved to transnational level as well, because as I said, this is happening in many different countries. So creating alliances and engaging with similar other movements is not so difficult anymore. So I will now more or less end with a final note. And I know that final notes have to be positive, and it's Friday afternoon and we all need some positive thoughts for the weekend in our heads. But I think I'm not going to do that. I think it is my job now also to sort of remind all of us that in all corners of the world, as we speak now, civil society organizations and human rights defenders are facing extreme amount of challenges. And these challenges come not only from governments, but also businesses themselves. And these changes also range from criminalization of the work of these human rights defenders to threats, attacks, and even killings. And especially women human rights defenders are much more vulnerable and much more exposed to this kind of challenges. So I think we constantly need to remind ourselves about this fact. And I think it is also important then to acknowledge this and to make this really part of any campaign that CSOs are planning to launch, one of the core components of any part of the campaign. So I will end there. Çok teşekkür ediyorum hepinizi dinlediğiniz için beni.
Biz teşekkür ederiz. Thank you, Başak. I suppose that you missed one slide about a map that you were going, I think you mistakenly taken it out. Do you want us to show that? I think we have the map.
You're muted now.
You're muted. Okay.
Yes, you can show that. That's taken from a website of the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. This is a very useful website that I would recommend the CSOs to visit anyway, irrespective of the map. And I simply wanted to show what is happening with regards to the national legislation in different parts of Europe. And as you see, in many instances, it is the CSOs who have taken the lead actually to start those campaigns. Although in some cases, it is the parliamentarians. For example, in France, actually, it was the parliamentarians who initiated the devoir de vigilance law. But other than that, I just wanted to show this also as a source for our audience, that they may go and check the links contained in there, which is very useful, I think, for civil society in general. But thank you for sharing this.
Thank you. Thank you for also walking us through a good example from a small country with a huge per capita income. However, I don't know if Luxembourg is one of the members of the G20. I think it's not.
No, I don't think so, no.
Turkey is. Turkey is one of the biggest countries in the world as well, and the 20th biggest economy in the world at the moment. A couple of years ago, it was 17th biggest economy, but hey. Although this is a small country with a huge per capita income, I think it's still relevant as a good example. So thank you for walking us through that. What I can hear actually is that it is the obligation of the state to regulate the business environment. And it's the obligation of the state to provide an environment for business to flourish, but also that respects human rights. So do not harm. Of course, earn money, but do not harm. Provide an environment for your workers in, best of human dignity and, so basically what we're saying is it is the obligation of the state to regulate, and it is most probably I can say that the human rights organizations that are doing human rights monitoring, it is their somehow responsibility in the first line of work to monitor the human rights abuses and show with data that this can be done. And this has to stop if we want to have a better economy. Okay, so I would like to thank everyone for joining in to our webinar. Thank you for each and every speaker for their invaluable interventions and providing us with all the necessary answers, I guess. So have a good day, have a good evening, a wonderful Friday, the rest of the day, and have a good weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.